Before we get started, I just want to explain you have two sheets of paper in front of you. One is a sheet of paper called the brainstorming sheet, and we'll walk through what you can do with that in a minute and when we get into the main activity. But before we start that part, I do want to ask you to take a few minutes to complete the demographic questionnaire. So this includes just a couple of questions to understand a little bit more about who you are and who's participating in this group. So if you could take just a few minutes to complete that. Once you've had a chance to do so, we'll begin the brainstorming session. All right, so thank you so much for coming here today for session 1 of the concept mapping. What we're going to be doing today is answering the following question. So what we want to do is have input from all of our participants, so thank you for being here, on answers to this question. And what we're going to try to do is generate a list of responses. So not long, detailed explanations, but we want to have just a list in response to the question, what are the factors that contribute to personal health and well-being? So the focus here is on health and well-being and what things contribute to that. So that means what things influence health and well-being, what things impact health and well-being. And what I'm going to ask you to do right now is just take a few minutes to think about your responses to this focal prompt. They think contributes to personal health and well-being. So who wants to volunteer to give us a couple of items to put on the list here? So I will write down your responses and we'll go around the room and hear from everyone what they think and what their answer was to this focal prompt. So we want to make sure again to hear from everybody in the group. So think about how you're going to provide your answer. So we're going to take a few minutes to have you think about your responses to the focal prompt. Again, the question is listed here. In front of you, you have a sheet of paper. If you want to go ahead and write down any of your answers or make any notes to help you remember, you're welcome to do so, and you can do that on the sheet in front of you. All right, so now that we've had a few minutes to think about, and some of us have written down our responses to the focal prompt, so what are the factors that contribute to personal health and well-being, I'd like to see if we have anyone who wants to volunteer to share a couple of items, and I'll write them up here on the board. Yes?
Sleep.
Sleep, okay. Do you have anything else that you want to share?
Family and illness.
Family and illness. Is that separate? Those are two different things. So sleep is one, family is one, and illness is a third.
Yes.
Great. So thank you for sharing. So we have these 3 things in response to this question. Did anybody else come up with other ideas? Want to add to that? So it looks like we've developed a very comprehensive list of responses, so thank you all for sharing, in response to this focal question, and we really appreciate your input. And so we've gone through and generated a number of items. I've written them down. I posted them around the room so that you can see them all. I just want to make sure, is there anything else that's missing from this list? You know, we've gone through quite a bit. Do you have any remaining ideas or thoughts of things that need to be included? Okay, that's fine. So if you do and you think of something, you can write it down on your brainstorming sheet in front of you, that's fine. So now what's the next step? So this, as you know, is just part of a multi-step process. And so what we're going to do is take the list that we've generated here and all of the items and combine them with the other groups that we're doing. So we're doing several other groups similar to this. We'll combine them all into a single list, and that list will contain items and responses from all of the groups. And when you come back for the next activity, what we'll do is ask you to share your thoughts about the similarities and differences between the items. And so we want to understand your ideas about how some of the items are similar to each other or maybe quite different from each other. Because again, we've generated quite a list in response to this focal prompt. So thank you so much for your participation. We really appreciate you taking the time. Again, if you have any other thoughts or things that are not up here, please write it down on your sheet or let us know. And I think we've come up with a very comprehensive list, so I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you. So welcome back to session 2. The goal here today is to discuss the items that were generated during session 1. And you'll remember that we had multiple sessions, multiple groups who answered the same focal prompt. In this case it was, what are the factors that contribute to personal health and well-being? We took all of the responses from the previous groups and developed a single list of responses. In this case, when we put everybody together, there were 75 different items that people and participants felt were important for personal health and well-being. And today what we want to do are 2 activities. We want to understand the similarities and differences between the items, and then we also want to understand how important they are to various pieces, right? So it may be that stress is very important to personal health and well-being, while issues about sleep may be perceived as less important. So what we're going to do here today is 2 activities. 1, group them according to similarities and differences, and 2, rate them. And so that's why this session is called the sorting and rating session. So what we've done in the time between when we met last time and when we met now is generate that master list and came up with, like I said, all of the items in response to the focal prompt. We put them onto individual cards and created a deck of those cards for use today. So for example, item number 28 here is stress, and then the next one is sleep. And so it goes through and lists out all the items that were generated in the previous sessions. So we're going to use these, what we call sorting cards, today in our activity. We'll also do the rating sheets. And so remember, we want to understand not just similarities and differences, but we want to understand their relative importance. And so we have a rating sheet example here that we'll walk through as part of this session. So again, the goal is to take the items that were generated here and understand them a little bit more. And remember that we took items from all of the groups who participated in session 1, and we've generated a master list, which we will now use in session 2. The first activity will be to sort the cards into piles that make sense to you. So again, you have a pile of cards that are in front of you that are included in this envelope. And what I'm going to ask you to do is take that pile out of the envelope and sort them into groups that make sense to you. And this, let's just pause here for a minute, because there is no right or wrong answer. We want to understand how similar or dissimilar the items are according to your perspective and belief. And so this is an individually oriented activity. You're going to sit in the space where you are, go through all of the items, and then put them into piles that make sense to you. And everybody might do that slightly differently, and so it's important after you put your items into a pile that you take that pile, let's just say it's got 6 items in it, you look through each of those 6 items, you put, why did I put these together? Think about it for a minute, and then you take your sorting sheet that's also in your packet, and I ask that you write down the item number. So in this case, personal hygiene has the item number 7 next to it. I would write the item number 7 here and list out all of the item numbers that you have in your pile. and then a name or a reason why you put those together into the same pile. So maybe things, in this case it's things that are about an individual and a person, so their stress and their personal hygiene. You can write that down and put a name to it, and do that for all of your cards. So if you have 7 piles, then you're going to go through here and you're going to list out all 7 piles, the numbers for them, and then the name or the reason why you put them together. So just a couple of instructions about how to do this sorting activity. So you probably want to read through all of the items that are listed on the cards first, then sort them into piles, and then just a couple of things to keep in mind is that you don't need to create categories according to priority, right? Like most important or least important. We're looking for how do the items relate to each other. So are they related to interpersonal things? Are they related to an individual? However it is that you think about them, use that to group your items. And also, we don't want each item to be on its own. That's not as helpful. And we don't want them all to be in one group. What we're looking for is you to say, you know, here's between 3 and 10 different groups. And so person A might say there are 5 categories and put them into 5 groups. The person next to them may say 7 categories and put them into 7 groups. Totally fine. Again, no right or wrong answer. But if you can aim for between 3 and 10, so 3 being the minimum number of groups and 10 being the maximum, that's most helpful for us because ultimately we're looking for group consensus. So we'll take this data, enter it all together into a software program which tells us for everyone who did the sorting activity, what's the group consensus about how these items relate to each other. So that's it for the sorting activity. So the second activity is the rating activity. And again, we have a rating sheet that was in your envelope. And in this activity, you're actually going to rate on 2 response scales. And the items are exactly the same as those that you sorted earlier. So in this case, there are 75 items. And we want you to read through each of the items that are listed here on the sheet and answer the question. In this case, it's about the importance of the item. So for this rating scale that I have in front of me, it's on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all important and 5 is extremely important. Rate each item based on the following question. How important is each item to your personal health? So again, all the same items are on here that were generated as part of section 1. And so for example, stress is listed here, and we're asking on a scale of 1 to 5, how important is that to your personal health? So 1, not at all, 5, extremely important. And what I want to just note in a couple of instructions here is we want you to use that range of the scale. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, not at all, 5, extremely. If it's pretty important but not extremely important, use a 4. If it's kind of related but not totally not related, then use a 2. So use that whole range. So when you look at the 75 items, use the whole range from 1 to 5 for each item. And so if you can go through and answer that, and what you'll do is just circle your response just to the side of each item. And then if you can just check when you're done that you've answered each of the items. It's a lot, I know, but it's actually super helpful for us when we enter this data later to identify which are the most important. We know they're all important because you answered this question and told us about them, but we want to know which are the most important. And so if you can go through for all 75 items and answer the rating scale for that. And then in this case, like I said, there are actually 2 rating scales. So you'll find another rating scale in your envelope as well, and you'll follow the same instructions. So for this rating portion, you're going to answer 2 rating scales for each of the items that are listed. All right, so this is the second way to do the sorting activity. It's a slightly modified version of what we just reviewed. And this is a good approach when you want to have direct communication with the participants. So again, we have the same items that are listed here. Each one is on a card, same as we talked about earlier, so there are 75 items. But in this case, what we're going to do is have facilitators work with participants directly to sort them. But it's driven by the participants, right? So what they think. The facilitator is just there to help the process. We have the cards, they each have an item listed on them, and then in this sorting activity we have several baskets that we're going to use to facilitate the process. So in this case we have 10 baskets. The goal is to keep the number of groupings to 10 or below, and ideally 3 or above, right? So let's start at the beginning. We put out a couple of baskets and we say to the participant, all right, so remember we have the items that were generated in response to the focal prompt. In this case, the first item is sleep, and we'll put that in basket number 1. The second item is friends. Is that similar to sleep, or do we want to put it in its own basket? So in this case, let's say they want to put it in their own basket, its own basket. The third item is having someone to talk to. Which basket do we want to put that in? Is it sleep or friends? Let's just say in the hypothetical they say friends, great. Then the fourth item is time management. Ooh, is that related to sleep, having someone to talk to, and friends, or is it on its own? In this case, let's just put it on its own, just for argument's sake. The fifth item is having a significant other or a partner. And you're going to want to remind your participants. You currently have 3 baskets: sleep, having someone to talk to, and time management. Where would you like to place significant other or partner? So I'm going to guess that they'll put it in the second basket. And you just continue through this process, right? So in this case, it's family. I'm going to guess it goes in the middle basket. But it's really important that I, as the facilitator, not lead the participant, right? That what my job is to facilitate. My job is to remind them what's in each basket, and then to ask very open-ended, openly, which basket would you like to place it into? So once you've done that for all of the cards in your pile, what you're going to do is go through the items for each basket and record them on the sorting sheet. You'll remember from the first sorting activity description where participants did this directly themselves. In this facilitated version, you would actually write them down. So item number 25 here is family, so I would write 25. 35 is significant other, I would write that here. And then having someone to talk to is item number 34. So I would write those item numbers in here, and then I would ask the participant, tell me why you put these into the same pile. And whatever their response is, you write that as the name of the pile. That's really the justification. Why are they put together in the same pile? And just remember that the goal here is really to understand how the participant thinks about how these items are related to each other. And so in the facilitator-led approach, we really want to ensure that we're not biasing them, and that we are simply facilitating by reading and helping to place them into the piles and ultimately recording it onto their sorting sheet. This is the second version of the ratings. In this case, it's facilitator-led, so it's slightly different from what we talked about before, in that for each of the items, the facilitator is going to read them to the participant and ask for their response. And so what's most important here is to remind the participants of the response categories. They're exactly the same for all of the items. In this case, in the example, it's important. So 1 is not at all important, 5 is extremely important, and we're asking participants to rate each item based on the following question. How important is each item to your personal health? So I would then just read through the items and record their response. So the first item is sleep. How important is that to your personal health? Remember, the scale is from 1, not at all, to 5, extremely important. And I would literally ask them that question, and then I would record it on the sheet here. So I would circle 5, let's just say hypothetically that sleep is extremely important to their personal health. And I would go through the list and I would keep reading them. And so I would say, okay, thank you for that answer for sleep. Now the next question we have is about your personal hygiene. So how important is your personal hygiene to your personal health? And again, response category of 1, not at all, to 5, extremely important. And in this case, maybe they say 4. So I circle the 4. So you're going to go through all of the items for all of the rating scales. So in this hypothetical example, we have 2 rating scales, so you'll do 2 different rating sheets. What is really important here is that you don't skip any of the items. We don't want any missing data, and that you remind participants to use the whole range of the scale, right? In the same way that we just reminded them to do so if they're doing it themselves, 1 to 5, but there's 2, 3, and 4 in the middle there too, and ask them to use that distribution. So once you're done with those, so you're done with the rating sheets, in this second example, you'll also have your sorting sheet from the participant. You want to make sure that everything has a participant identification number on it, and you're going to put all of their information back into their envelope, right? So this is the same process that you should follow if they're doing it themselves. You should make sure that everything is labeled with their participant ID. In this case, it's number 1. So on the sorting sheet, it's number 1. Oh, and look at that. It's not on the rating sheet. So I would write down participant number 1 to make sure that we don't lose track. And then I put that all into their envelope. And this is just a way of keeping track of all of the data. So then, when you're all done with the sorting and rating activity, so this is again session 2, you want to ensure that you also have the demographic questionnaire for them. Hopefully this was collected at session 1, but if it wasn't, or you have a new participant, now's the opportunity to collect this information. So just go ahead and make sure to collect the responses for the demographic questions and to include that in the packet. So we're done with session 2. We really appreciate all of your input. We want to make sure that all of the data that we've collected from you are in your envelope and that they're being collected by the facilitators. And I just want to remind you that this is a multi-step process. So you remember from session 1, we collected your answers in response to this focal question. Session 2, what we've done is get more information about similarities and differences between items and the relative importance and the ratings. What we will do now is take all of that data, so all the data from the participants in this group, all of the data from participants of session 2 in other locations, and we'll enter that into a software program that will help us identify group consensus. And so when we come back for session 3, what we're going to do is share the results from everyone. So we'll say, how do people see them, the items as similar or different? Which items are most similar? And then which items are most important? And we'll have a group discussion about those results. So this is session 2, and in session 3, it's called the interpretation session. And what we'll do is come back and really interpret the data. So welcome back. We're at session 3, so this is the last of the 3 sessions. And what we're going to do today is share some of the results from the previous sessions and then engage in a discussion about them to really understand a little bit more. And so at this point we had a response to the focal question We compiled all of those responses into a master list. We asked you to sort them into piles that made sense to you, and then to rate them on the rating scales. We took all of that data from you, the participants here, as well as participants from the other groups, and we created some maps. So in this case, those are what we call concept maps, which is essentially a thought map. And so it illustrates similarities and differences between the items. So remember, we had 75 items, and we asked you to group them into piles. And when we took all of that data and we ran some analyses, in this case multidimensional scaling and some cluster analysis, we looked at which items did a majority of participants think were very similar to each other, and we generated a map. In this case, it was a 9 cluster solution. So this is the 9 cluster concept mapping solution. So all 75 items are represented here, and then there are 9 clusters of groupings. And again, that takes everybody's data, looks at the similarity matrices, counts that up for all participants, and then creates what we call a thought map. And tells us that items that are closer together were believed by the groups and by all the participants to be most similar to each other. So items that are close together on the map are perceived to be quite similar to each other. Again, this is just helpful for us because dealing with 75 items can be quite a lot. But now we know that there are 9 categories of items, or 9 clusters. So already we have a really good understanding of what are the factors that contribute to personal health and well-being. There are 75 things. Those group into 9 different themes. And what we want to understand now is how do those 9 different themes relate to personal health and well-being. And so what we're going to ask you to do is engage in a discussion with us. So we're going to walk through the map and each of the clusters, share the items that are in the clusters, and then ask you to tell us, why do you think those are all together in the same cluster? What's their relationship to personal health and well-being? And I'll just give you an example here of a cluster. Let me just get my notes here. So a cluster here that includes friends, family, having someone to talk to, a significant other, peers, and pets. Those were all items that were grouped together into the same cluster. And what I would ask you to do is tell me, how do those items relate to each other, and how do they relate to personal health and well-being? So first off, what should we call this cluster of items? So mentees, friends, family, having someone to talk to, significant others, peers, pets. So in this case, in a hypothetical, maybe a participant might say, or the group might say, those are relationships that we have with other people. Great, so how are relationships with friends and families and having someone to talk to related to personal health and well-being? And what I would like to hear from the group is a discussion of those pieces. So we have these items that are grouped together. We want to have a better understanding of how they relate to each other. And so we might ask participants to discuss in a group how they're related to each other and have a discussion. And what we would do was record that using an audio recording. We can also ask participants if they want to draw a picture or if they want to write something down. So in this case, we would say cluster number 4 equals relationships, right? And then we have all of the items listed here, and we would say, do you want to draw us a picture? Do you want to tell us a story about how do these items of friends, families, having someone to talk to, a significant other, really relate to personal health and well-being? And so You know, it might be that they draw a picture of themselves and they say that they like to feel supported by their family and then their friends. And that having a pet, I'm not a very good drawer, but maybe this is a cat. Also kind of looks like a fish, but a cat is really important, and that all of these relate to their health and well-being. Yeah, I know, it's not a great cat. But the point of this is to use as many modes for discussion that will really facilitate an in-depth discussion of how it is that these items relate to your focal prompt and your area of interest, right? And so if it is that drawing a picture is most helpful, we found that that works. Sometimes with groups, they like to sit and have the piece of paper in their hand and just have a discussion, in which case you can have a note taker writing down notes, or you can have an audio recorder. Session 3 is where it gets a little more flexible in terms of what you actually do for the session itself. But what is most important is the information that I just shared earlier about how to explain how you got here, right? So to provide a description of the concept map, and to provide a description and discussion of how it is that we came up with the 9 clusters in this case. And so it's really important to share that all their data, so all of the participants plus everyone else who did a session 2 and did the sorting and rating, that their data is entered into the software and used to create this map which illustrates group consensus. And to remind everybody about how we got from session 1 and boiled that down and added them all together to create 75 items. Their data was all entered into the software program. We looked at the similarities in terms of how people sorted things together and generated a map where it's the distance between the items that matters. That items that are close together were perceived by a majority of the group to be very similar, while items that are further apart from each other were perceived to be quite different. And that's really helpful, because now we're not just talking about 75 items, we're talking about 9 clusters or groupings of items. And so we can answer our question of what are the factors that contribute to personal health and well-being. We can say, well, there's an awful lot that does. In fact, there are 75 things that contribute, but there's in fact grouped into 9 categories. So at this point, we've gotten that far, and what the goal is for session 3 is to really understand which of those are most important, and you can use the rating data for that, and then how do they relate to personal health and well-being. So session 3 is really your opportunity to interpret the data. And so the specifics of how that happens may vary by project, but in general, it's going to focus on presenting the map and then asking participants to unpack and discuss the data a little bit further. And as I illustrated here, often that's done using markers and paper and asking participants to create images that explain how things relate to each other. And we found that to be incredibly successful. So when you're done with session 3, the data that you'll have will be the audio recordings from session 3. That will be any notes that facilitators have taken, and then also any maps or figures or anything that the participants have generated as part of that process, right? So these are data. So it's important that we then write somewhere on this before we pack it up that this is from a session 3 with group 1, right? It doesn't matter as much which participants really drew it, we just want to know where it's coming from. So this is data, and please make sure to keep all of these, and then we can digitize them when we're done. So I think that's it. So I've switch back and forth a little bit between the illustrative example and doing a hypothetical example. But what I want to finish with here is just when you're done with session 3, it's incredibly important that we thank our participants for their time. They've spent a lot of time with us at this point, and I absolutely understand that it can be a hardship to do so, but I think that their input is incredibly valuable. And so that's where just spending a few minutes really making sure that they know their value in terms of really helping us to move our study and our understanding of the topic forward. So in this case, it was around personal health and well-being, but whatever your topic is, to thank them for their time and expertise, because that's why we asked them to participate. And then to give them an understanding of where the project is going. So from this point forward, in this hypothetical example, we might seek to develop interventions that are related to promoting health and well-being and using the results from these discussions and these sessions might be very helpful for identifying which areas we should focus on first. Or depending upon the goal of your project, it may be to develop a new measurement scale which identifies particular issues. And so it may be that those topics that really get focused on the most in the interpretation are the ones that we should focus on in the scale as we move forward. So again, the goals of session 3 and the interpretation are absolutely dependent upon the goals of your project, but it's really important that we create a clear path of understanding for our participants in that we really value their conversations and input, we really appreciate their time and thoughts, and we hope that this will ultimately prove helpful.